Hello, colleagues. Welcome to the 2021 Labour7 Summit. Before we start, we need to run over some housekeeping. Firstly, some useful tools for you. The digital agenda is your personalised agenda for the day. To enter your sessions, you simply click on the session when it's starting. The resource gallery is home to event-related content. Please navigate to it from your digital agenda page. Here you will find supporting documents for the event. We have scheduled networking time planned at the end of the day. Please head over to the Meeting Hub at this time, where you can use the instant chat and messaging functions and request meetings with other attendees, which, once scheduled, will show up in your digital agenda. You can download the contact details of any attendees you network and connect with by clicking the Export button at the top right of the platform before the virtual event ends. To make the most of this function, and of course if you want to, you can add in your LinkedIn and contact details onto your profile. Here on the main stage, the discussion forum is available for general comments between attendees. Please use this space to discuss and feedback on the topics of the session. The Q&A function is to submit questions to the panel. You can upvote the best or most relevant questions. If you are having technical issues, there is live support available during the first 2 hours of this event. Click on the live support link at the top of the screen and an operator will be able to assist. After this time, please keep the discussion forum clear for session discussion and email all technical and programming queries to eventsupport@cabinetoffice.gov.uk for support.
Cet événement se déroulera en anglais. L'interprétation simultanée en français sera assurée via Interactio. Pour y accéder, saisir l'adresse app.interactio.io dans une nouvelle fenêtre de votre navigateur. Entrez le code de réunion L72021 et sélectionnez la langue pour entendre l'interprétation en direct sur votre appareil. Les instructions d'utilisation étape par étape pour toute personne souhaitant accéder à ce service sont disponibles dans la galerie de ressources de l'événement.
Please be aware all main stage sessions are being recorded. For the best viewing experience, we recommend you go full screen. Thank you very much for your attention, and we hope you enjoy the day.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the L7. My name is Paul Nowak. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the TUC, the UK's National Trade Union Centre. And with the UK assuming the presidency of the G7 and holding the G7 summit in June, we're proud to be hosting this event, albeit online. Let me start by thanking the Cabinet Office for their support, but thanks to everybody that's joined us this morning. It is great to welcome so many friends from right across the international labour movement. We've got three fantastic speakers in this opening session: Sharan Burrow, the ITUC General Secretary; Therese Coffey, the UK Secretary of State for Work and Pensions; and Kevin Courtney, who's the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union and the TUC's General Council International Lead. And I'll be introducing their remarks in a few moments' time. Now, this summit will run in two sessions today and tomorrow. And we really have one simple aim across those sessions: to put the interests of Labour, the interests of working people, their families and communities, firmly on the G7 agenda. Not just making sure our collective voice is heard, but that we actively shape the post-pandemic landscape, building a global economy that puts people and planet first, promoting democratic values at work and in civil society, improving health and social protection, addressing the climate emergency and creating millions of good green jobs, and delivering more inclusive prosperity. Now, clearly, stronger unions, better labour rights, more collective bargaining are crucial to all of this. Unions would say that, but the OECD, IMF, even the World Economic Forum all recognise the need to boost the bargaining power of low and middle income workers. But we now need policies to actually make that happen, policies nationally and internationally. I'm delighted, for example, that we've now got, and I know we've got colleagues on from the AFL-CIO, an American president who really gets the need for change. And I hope that other governments and other international institutions will follow his lead and positively and actively engage with trade unions. It does really feel like we've reached an historic crossroads. Unfettered free market globalization has run its course. The financial crash, the living standards crisis, the pandemic have all highlighted the need for fundamental change to our global political economy. We don't just need to build back stronger, we also need to build back fairer, greener, and more equal. And with the G7 coming up and the COP26 following soon after, this is our chance to set that positive agenda. So I hope and I'm sure that we will have a stimulating, productive discussion over the next 2 days to set out our vision of a better future for working people and to win the change that we need. With that in mind, it gives me huge pleasure to introduce our first speaker, my good friend Sharan Burrow, the General Secretary of the ITUC, a teacher by trade. Sharan is a lifelong trade unionist. She became General Secretary of the ITUC in 2010, the first woman ever to hold that position. And ever since then, she's been fighting hard day in, day out for workers right around the globe. Sharan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. And indeed, thank you to the TUC, Francis, Paul, the leadership. I know that you've put a lot of effort into bringing us together, but you've also set a really strong leadership at a time when the UK is, as a government, is in a very important position. They're hosting the G7, they're hosting the COP, and of course their influence in the G20 means that this year, in a global context, their leadership and therefore your leadership and influence is very much appreciated by us. There's no doubt that as we look to the future, Paul set the context really well, but SDG 8, the ambition for decent work, has to be realised for workers in the G7, in the G20, but indeed right around the world. We have a broken labour market, and it was actually indeed there before COVID-19, and COVID-19's just exposed those cracks and indeed craters in terms of the security or lack thereof for working people. 60% working informally, no rights, no minimum wage, no rule of law. And of course, that includes most of the workers in platform business. And it's not just limited to developing economies. And then of the 40% in global, in the so-called formal workforce around the world, more than a third are in precarious or insecure work. We need to repair the labour market. We must see decent work everywhere. And of course, we have the tools to do that. So let me just describe also the ambitions that I'm sure Guy Ryder will outline in line with our own social call for a new social contract. There's no doubt that the Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work, the ILO Centenary Declaration, laid out a roadmap. This ILO conference, that roadmap will be reinforced as indeed the basis for, as Paul said, building a future economy that is fairer, is indeed based on shared prosperity, deals with the climate challenge and puts jobs, decent work at the heart. We know that if we're going to reach that ambition, then the ILO's Centenary Declaration is vital on a number of core fronts. The first is that to repair that labour market, to achieve decent work, we need the labour protection floor, or the rights that and protections that were indeed negotiated with employers and governments for all workers, irrespective of their employment relationship. And they were fundamental rights. Paul said it, but indeed, if we're going to repair our democracies, if we're going to recognise that less than 50% of people live in democracy, and that's not conducive for decent work, then we need those fundamental rights. Freedom of association sits at the heart of democracy, and indeed it is with collective bargaining, with the right to organise, the way in which we ensure trust in democracies. But we need more than that. We need, in fact, occupational health and safety to be a fundamental right. The risk that our frontline workers, those brilliant workers, too often low paid, mostly women, actually put themselves in the front lines of saving our lives. We need to make sure that with April 28, just two days away, we actually fight for occupational health and safety as a fundamental right to save lives at work. We also need an adequate minimal living wage for all workers based on evidence, and we need some control over maximum hours of work with the explosion of telework and indeed other violations, as we've just seen the massive Amazon campaign that's exposed the absolute denial of rights. But we also need universal social protection underpinning that. And because every worker must have the security of the resilience that offers. And we need global solidarity to make that possible for the poorest countries. We're asking the G7 to take this up in the G20, in the IFIs around the world, and with their own actions. And we need a transformative agenda for women, for indeed the inclusion of race, people who come from different races, and of course, income inequality. And we need just transition for climate and for technology if we want to see jobs at the heart. Now, our colleagues will tell you about their own countries, and indeed being privileged to be part of the Biden summit. I have to say to Rich and the AFL leadership and members, you are in a hot seat. The EU's committed, of course, to just transition, to a pillar of rights, and to indeed a recovery plan with a plan for financing. But the US is now committed to climate change equaling jobs. And on May 1, we will focus on jobs, jobs, and jobs. So we must have climate ambition, but it must be job-centred, and it must commit to those fundamental rights to allow workers to help shape the future, to be at the table, to bargain for fair wages and conditions, as well as the security of work. We have all the tools we need. Let's make it happen. So thank you very much to the TUC. And in advance, thank you to the UK government, because I have to say the experience with the Sherpa has indeed been a very positive one to date. So let's hope the leaders are now paying attention so we can see workers, jobs, rights, and decent wages, indeed decent work at the heart of this outcome.
Thanks, Sharan. And you mentioned the UK government, and now our next speaker is Therese Coffey, who's the UK Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Therese was appointed to her post in September 2019 and previously held ministerial positions in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and served as the Deputy Leader of the House of Commons. Now, Therese, you will know that there are lots of domestic issues that we will need to work through with the government from what more we can all collectively do to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on young people and their employment, to keep workplaces safe, obviously, and also to ensure that we have decent sick pay that gives people the financial security to be able to self-isolate. So a big agenda alongside lots of other domestic issues, but absolutely delighted alongside that you've been able to join us to help open this international event and to address union colleagues from around the globe. Therese, you're most welcome. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and for inviting me to speak at the Labour7 conference. It was very interesting to hear from Sharan with her international role. And I know that Sharan was in teaching, and I understand Kevin will be speaking after me, the General Secretary of the National Education Union. So happens both my parents were teachers, both were members of the unions. In fact, my mother was telling me about how she was the union organiser in a part of her school in Liverpool. So it's very important to me that the partnership that we have, and I'm pleased to hear from Sharan a view of how the Sherpas have been responding in order to make sure the voices of people representing workers, as well as the other aspects of B7, will come together in order to try and provide that view, that shared purpose in time for the Leaders' Summit in June. I really want to thank you all for the hard work that's already underway. I appreciate this forum, but also the task force more broadly. And sadly, while we don't have a ministerial track, the chair is preparing that summary with that, as I say, that unity of purpose about building back better. And it's my expectation there will be further opportunity for dialogue beyond the June summit hosted by the G7 leaders. I mean, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a global impact. We've seen many people expected to work even harder than before under a lot of pressure, while at the same time, sadly, many people have been made redundant. And as well as the impacts of confinement measures, let's be candid, our economies have been hit hard with the loss of working hours, which estimated globally to be equivalent to about 255 million full-time jobs. And within that, in responding, the response to the effects of the pandemic have also had to be unprecedented in scale and scope. And I'm pleased that countries across the G7 have adopted a wide range of measures that supporting workers, young people, businesses, in order to try and not only try and keep people in work, but in effect protecting both livelihoods and lives has been the dual purpose of governments around the world. And this situation is evolving. That's why it's important, alongside our ongoing response to the immediate impact, we should already be looking ahead both at our recovery plans, but also learning the lessons of how we've had to adapt in the world of work in order for us to grasp the opportunity to build our labour markets back better. As been mentioned about being more resilient, more inclusive, and more green. Now, looking to the G7 presidency, I'm conscious that it's the aim of my Prime Minister to develop a shared agenda for that international and national economic recovery, addressing those points in a way that delivers jobs, prosperity, and well-being for all our citizens. And while my Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, understandably talks about jabs, certainly within Cabinet, within the UK government, we've already been talking about the next half of the year, which we've already started the work on, is about jobs. I really want to thank the L7 for coordinating the engagement group views. I appreciate you've been working with Youth 7, Women's 7, and the Business 7 to share with the Employment Task Force members on how to prepare our labour markets for 2030 in a way that everyone benefits. And I think in particular, things that have stood out will be the lifelong learning, having that prioritised, ensuring, working with the G20 about how we get adequate social protection around the world, and also about tackling discrimination and racism in the workplace. So it's an important element of how we then come back together to promote decent work, the green jobs that's been referred to, but good quality jobs, and also how we engage or make sure women are not excluded from the labour market. So in terms of the UK response, as you mentioned, Paul, there have been some elements where we will continue to work, and I know it's been welcomed about things like the job retention scheme, also known as the furlough scheme, where over 11 million jobs have been supported. We also have to think the world of work, it, of course, covers people who are self-employed. And again, there have been grants to support many of those people in that situation. We continue to also try and we have a new system of benefits which covers both out of work and in work people. And that's where we've also tried to have a temporary uplift, recognising some of the extra costs that have gone through that way. Moving forward, the activity I'm working on in particular is about the youth programme, about Plan for Jobs. It's something we call Kickstart, and that's where we are effectively paying for 6-month job placements for the 16 to 24-year-olds who are, candidly the most economically affected in this country by the lack of the usual opportunities which people might enjoy in the work market. We've taken on we talk often about our jabs army who are vaccinating people. We've got our jobs army, and we've taken on an extra 13,000 work coaches to try and get people, 13,500, sorry, to get people into back into work. I think the other important part which I cover is about how we get people to work safely. And while the Health and Safety at Work Act is a very important part of that, the responsibilities are split on nationally between some of our local councils, but also what's called the Health and Safety Executive. That's been a crucial role. I know that in particular, there's been, I think, spot checks. There's been over nearly 200,000 interventions to see how businesses are implementing measures. And it's one of the themes that I will continue to try and draw on in my discussions with ministers around the world about how that is seen as an absolute priority, both through G7, but also through the work that we can do with OECD and beyond. So alongside the extension of support, it is about trying to help people to get back into work safely in a more normal way, perhaps. Of course, what is the new normal? That'll be part of the discussions that I'm sure we'll still be working through on how we make sure that the recovery is done in a fair way and that building back better is building back stronger. And I'm conscious that together we can try and make that happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Secretary of State, for your remarks. And I mean, I think it goes without saying there'll be lots of issues where the TUC and the government don't always agree, but you mentioned just in your remarks things like the job retention scheme, the support that was put in place to support the self-employed throughout the pandemic. These are really good examples of the value of unions and employers and governments working together, and examples that we would want to build on in the UK, obviously, but throughout the work of the L7 as well. Our final speaker in this session is the TUC's General Counsel International Spokesperson, Kevin Courtney. As Therese mentioned, Kevin is another teacher by profession, and he was elected General Secretary of what was then the National Union of Teachers in 2016. And he is now Joint General Secretary of a new union, the National Education Union, alongside Mary Bowstead, that new union representing teachers across the UK. Kevin, thanks for joining us today. Look forward, as always, to your contribution.
Thank you, Paul. And I am really pleased to be here today under the auspices of the Labour7. Together, we're representing workers across the G7 nations, me representing the TUC. And I want to repeat Paul's thanks to Therese for her speech and her engagement this morning. And really good, Therese, to hear about your union member parents. Our trades union movement is founded on the values of solidarity and internationalism. And we know that in our lived reality, policies that hurt workers anywhere hurt workers everywhere. So the issues we're going to talk about over the next 2 days have global resonance. The decisions the G7 leaders will take later this year will have global resonance. The pandemic has brought this into even sharper focus. This crisis is global. COVID, its impact are global. We need a global response. We need significant action to address the structural inequality that causes so much suffering in our own countries, but especially in the global south. We believe it's crucial that G7 ministers listen to voices from all over the world, and we can help with that. As affiliates of the ITUC, we are part of an interlinked movement of over 200 million workers worldwide. We can reach workers almost anywhere in the world, and they can reach us. So we want to say to the G7 ministers, if you want to talk to a trades unionist on the other side of the world, start by talking to the one next to you. We'll be looking at the G7's priorities from a global perspective, and it's in that context that I want to say something about democratic values, the pandemic, and the climate emergency. And firstly, on democratic values, we see these threats as more pressing than ever. Trades unions and trades unionists and their vital freedoms are often the first to fall in the face of authoritarianism. And we have seen a terrifying rise of the far right and authoritarianism, whether it's Hungary, Brazil, India, or Poland. We see regimes using the COVID crisis to crack down further on rights and to bring in anti-worker policies. Any discussion around democratic values must look at this worrying trend and the implications it has for democracy. We also need to look at the examples in the G7 countries themselves of attempts to make freedom of speech or the right to assembly more difficult. And we note that governments and opposition parties outside, but sometimes also inside the G7, have used divisive anti-migrant rhetoric. Migrant workers and refugees, those from minority ethnic backgrounds in those countries, been exposed to the most harm in this pandemic. So we want to say to the G7 countries have sometimes been too ready to negotiate trade deals with countries where workers face exploitation and their trades union representatives face violence and repression, instead of trying to insist on reform. We also need the G7 at home to recognize that trades unions, social dialogue, collective bargaining are actually at the heart of democratic values. Workers are taking the lead in tackling the divisions that weaken our society. And we're going to hear later from Dr. Patrick Roach, who's the chair of the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force, on how workers are addressing fundamental inequalities and injustices and what the G7 could do to support us in tackling them. Pandemic. We have to say that nationalism and profit-seeking must not get in the way of achieving the widest possible vaccine coverage. It's often been said, but it does bear repetition. No one is safe until everyone is safe. So we believe we need an urgent waiver of intellectual property rights so that global South countries can produce affordable versions of patented COVID vaccines. The public good in this case must prevail over the interests of big pharma or of financial speculation. And this position has been supported by many former heads of state, heads of government, and Nobel laureates in a recent letter. But we also think the G7 needs to, and we see this recognition, that preventing future death and disruption needs more than just vaccines. Workers need to be able to afford to stay at home when they're sick. They need support when whole industries shut down. They need protection from unsafe working conditions. And we think that support at the International Labour Organization to make workplace health and safety a fundamental right would be a strong start to dealing with those things. Thirdly, lastly, we need to tackle the climate emergency. The world of work has a huge part to play in delivering that green economy that we need. We need a just transition, industrial change that doesn't abandon workers or their communities, but instead works with them and makes them part of the solution. We need to see that in firm policies and in conversations with workers that have to start now. When we talk of building back better to prosperity, it's important that we think about where we're building back from. The pandemic may have caused new problems, but it has also cast fresh, new light on fundamental, pre-existing and structural inequalities. Persistent inequality and discrimination, structural racism, global supply chains ending in countries with no enforcement of labour rights, a retreat from public investment in key services and infrastructure, failure to grapple tax evasion worldwide have all meant dealing with the pandemic more difficult. So we need specific action. We need due diligence laws to protect the global workforce. We need trade deals with enforceable protections for human rights. We need agreement on patents for vaccines and much more. We need to defend a vision of the world that prioritizes public investment guided by industrial strategy, strong social protections, access to free quality healthcare, to education and decent work. The trades union movements, and they're not just ours, but our fundamental values of collectivism and solidarity extend beyond national borders. That's the internationalism we want to see. We believe we can create a better, more just world with peace and social justice for all. Trades unions can play a crucial role in creating that reality, and we want to work with the G7 governments on doing that. Thank you for listening.
Thanks as ever, Kevin. I'm now going to bring this session to a close. First of all, I want to thank Kevin and Therese and Sharan for their contributions. And I also want to thank everybody that's facilitated the opening discussion behind the scenes. Lots of people are making sure that the technical things work well. Apologies to the translators. As usual, I spoke a little bit too quickly at the start. Hopefully, I've slowed down a little bit and they can forgive me for that error. Just a couple of observations before we close. There's going to be a 15-minute break after this session, and then we'll move into the session on democratic values and global action at 12:15. So people will hopefully be able to get a little bit of time for a comfort break before moving into that session. Over the course of the next couple of days, I think, as ever, the L7 provides an opportunity for people to share ideas and experience, absolutely crucial, building on all the good work that unions have done during the course of the pandemic and beyond. I think we should be using the next 2 days to unashamedly talk about the positive contribution of trade unions and our members to everything from our democratic life and democratic well-being right through to reshaping and creating the sort of economy that we want to see going forward. And I'm sure that as part of that, we will be putting the issue of good quality unionised jobs at the heart of all of our discussions as well. We know at the moment not every green job is a good job, never mind a unionised job. That gives us something to really run at over the course of the next couple of days. Thanks to everybody for listening in. Hopefully in future sessions you'll get an opportunity to come in for questions and answer. I'm going to bring things to a close there. Thanks, colleagues. Stay safe and enjoy the discussions over the next 2 days.